Harry stuffed the sneakoscope back inside his socks and threw it back into his trunk. All that could be heard now were Ron's stifled moans of pain and rage. Scabbers was huddled in Ron's hands. It had been a while since Harry had seen him out of Ron's pocket, and he was unpleasantly surprised to see that Scabbers, once so fat, was now very skinny. Patches of fur seemed to have fallen off him too. "He's not looking so good, is he?" Harry said. "It's stress," said Ron. "He'll be fine if that big stupid furball left him alone." But Harry, remembering what the woman at the magical menagerie had said about rats living only 3 years, couldn't help feeling that unless Scabbers had powers he had never revealed, he was reaching the end of his life. And despite Ron's frequent complaints that Scabbers was both boring and useless, he was sure Ron would be very miserable if Scabbers died. Christmas spirit was definitely thin on the ground in the Gryffindor common room that morning. Hermione had shut Crookshanks in her dormitory and was furious with Ron for trying to kick him. Ron was still fuming about Crookshanks' fresh attempt to eat Scabbers. Harry gave up trying to make them talk to each other and devoted himself to examining the firebolt, which he had brought down to the common room with him. For some reason this seemed to annoy Hermione as well. She didn't say anything, but she kept looking darkly at the broom, as though it too had been criticizing her cat. At lunchtime, they went down to the great hall to find that the house's tables had been removed against the walls again, and that a single table set for 12 stood in the middle of the room. Professors Dumbledore, McGonagall, Snape, Sprout, and Flitwick were there, along with Filch, the caretaker, who had taken off his usual brown coat and was wearing a very old and rather mouldy-looking tailcoat. There were only 3 other students, 2 extremely nervous-looking first-years, and a sullen-faced Slytherin fifth-year. "Merry Christmas," said Dumbledore as Harry, Ron, and Hermione approached the table. "As there are so few of us, it seemed foolish to use the house tables. Sit down, sit down." Harry, Ron, and Hermione sat side by side at the end of the table. "Crackers," said Dumbledore enthusiastically, offering the end of a large silver noisemaker to Snape, who took it reluctantly and tugged. With a bang like a gunshot, the cracker flew apart to reveal a large pointed witch's hat, topped with a stuffed vulture. Harry, remembering the boggart, caught Ron's eye, and they both grinned. Snape's mouth thinned, and he pushed the hat towards Dumbledore, who swapped it for his wizard hat at once. "Dig in," he advised the table, beaming around. As Harry was helping himself to roast potatoes, the doors of the great hall opened again. It was Professor Trelawney, gliding towards them as though on wheels. She had put on a green sequined dress in honor of the occasion, making her look more than ever like a glittering, oversized dragonfly. "Sybil, this is a pleasant surprise," said Dumbledore, standing up. "I have been crystal gazing, headmaster," said Professor Trelawney in her mistiest, most faraway voice, "and to my astonishment I saw myself abandoning my solitary luncheon and coming to join you. Who am I to refuse the prompting of fate? At once I hastened from the tower, and I beg you forgive my lateness." "Certainly, certainly," said Dumbledore, his eyes twinkling. "Let me draw you up a chair." And he did indeed draw a chair in mid-air with his wand, which revolved for a few seconds before falling with a thud between Professor Snape and McGonagall. Professor Trelawney, however, did not sit down. Her enormous eyes had been roving around the table, and she suddenly uttered a kind of soft scream. "I dare not, headmaster! If I join the table, we shall be of 13. Nothing could be more unlucky. Never forget that when 13 die together, the first to rise will be the first to die." "We'll risk it, Sybil," said Professor McGonagall impatiently. "Sit down, the turkey's getting cold." Professor Trelawney hesitated, then lowered herself into the empty chair, eyes shut and mouth clenched tight, as though expecting a thunderbolt to hit the table. Professor McGonagall poked a large spoon into the nearest tureen. "Tripe, Sybil!" Professor Trelawney ignored her. Eyes open again, she looked around it once more and said, "But where is dear old Professor Lupin?" "I'm afraid the poor fellow is ill again," said Dumbledore, indicating that everybody should start serving themselves. "Most unfortunate that it should happen on Christmas Day." "But surely you already knew that, Sybil?" said Professor McGonagall, her eyebrows raised. Professor Trelawney gave Professor McGonagall a very cold look. "Certainly I knew Minerva," she said, "but one does not parade the fact that one is all-knowing. I frequently act as though I am not possessed of the inner eye, so as not to make others nervous." "Well, that explains a great deal," said Professor McGonagall tartly. Professor Trelawney's voice suddenly became a good deal less mystery. "If you must know, Minerva, I have seen that Professor Lupin will not be with us for very long. He seems aware himself that his time is short. He positively fled when I offered to crystal gaze for him." "Imagine that," said Professor McGonagall dryly. "I doubt," said Professor Dumbledore, in a cheerful but slightly raised voice, which put an end to Professor McGonagall and Professor Trelawney's conversation, "that Professor Lupin is in immediate danger. Severus, you've made the potion for him again?" "Yes, Headmaster," said Snape. "Good," said Professor Dumbledore. "Then he should be up and about in no time. Derek, have you had any of these chipolatas? They're excellent." The first-year boy went furiously red on being addressed directly by Dumbledore, and took the platter of sausages with trembling hands. Professor Trelawney behaved almost normally until the very end of Christmas dinner, 2 hours later. Full of bursting with Christmas dinner and still wearing their party hats, Harry and Ron got up first from the table, and she shrieked loudly, "My dears! Which of you left first? Which?" "Dunno," said Ron, looking uneasily at Harry. "But will it make much difference?" said Professor McGonagall coldly. "Unless a mad axeman is waiting outside the doors to slaughter the first into the entrance hall." Even Ron laughed. Professor Trelawney looked highly affronted. "Coming," Harry said to Hermione. No," Hermione muttered. "I want a quick word with Professor McGonagall." "Probably trying to see if she can take any more classes," yawned Ron as they made their way into the entrance hall, which was completely devoid of mad axemen. When they reached the portrait hole, they found Sir Cadogan enjoying a Christmas party with a couple of monks, several previous headmasters of Hogwarts, and his fat pony. He pushed up his visor and toasted them with a flagon of mead. "Merry Christmas, password!" "Scurvy cur," said Ron. "And the same to you, sir!" roared Sir Cadogan, as the painting swung forward to admit him. Harry went straight up to the dormitory, collected the Firebolt and the broomstick servicing kit Hermione had given him for his birthday, brought them downstairs, and tried to find something to do to the Firebolt. However, there was no bent twigs to clip, and the handle was so shiny already it seemed pointless to polish it. He and Ron simply sat admiring it from every single angle, until the portrait hole opened and Hermione came in, accompanied by Professor McGonagall. Though Professor McGonagall was head of Gryffindor House, Harry had seen her in the common room only once before, and that had been to make a very grave announcement. He and Ron stared at her, both holding the Firebolt. Hermione walked around them, sat down, picked up the nearest book, and hid her face behind it. "So, that's it, is it?" said Professor McGonagall beadily, walking over to the fireside and staring at the Firebolt. "Miss Granger has just informed me that you have been sent a broomstick, Potter." Harry and Ron looked around at Hermione. They could see her forehead reddening over the top of her book, which was upside down. "May I?" said Professor McGonagall, but she didn't wait for an answer before pulling the Firebolt out of their hands. She examined it carefully from the handle to twig ends. And there was no note at all, Potter? No card? No message of any kind?" "No," said Harry blankly. "I see," said Professor McGonagall. "Well, I'm afraid I'll have to take this, Potter." What?" said Harry, scrambling to his feet. "Why?" "It will need to be checked for jinxes," said Professor McGonagall. "Of course, I'm no expert, but I dare say Madam Hooch and Professor Flitwick will strip it down." "Strip it down?" repeated Ron, as though Professor McGonagall was mad. "It shouldn't take more than a few weeks," said Professor McGonagall. "You'll have it back if we are sure it is jinx-free." "There's nothing wrong with it," said Harry, his voice shaking slightly. "There's nothing wrong with it," said Harry, his voice shaking slightly. Honestly, Professor, you can't know that, Potter, said Professor McGonagall quite kindly. Not until you've flown it, at any rate. And I'm afraid that is out of the question until we are certain that it has not been tampered with. I shall keep you informed. Professor McGonagall turned on her heel and carried the firebolt out of the porthole, which closed behind her. Harry stood staring after her, the tin of high finish polish still clutched in his hands. Ron, however, rounded on Hermione. What did you go running to McGonagall for? Hermione threw the book aside. She was still pink in the face, but stood up and faced Ron defiantly. Because I thought, and Professor McGonagall agrees with me, that broom was probably sent to you by Sirius Black.